The Fifth Estate.
32 people died. Are the facts being suppressed? The crash last October of a plane belonging to the Canadian oil company Panarctic has become enmeshed in rumor, gossip, and disturbing speculation. Today, a Panarctic employee presented a motion in the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories. It called for the inquest into the crash to be stopped or to have the conduct of the inquest reviewed. What are the facts of the worst air disaster in the Canadian Arctic? It was a plane like this, a Lockheed Electra, a 4-engined warhorse loaded with men and freight and bound for the gas and oil drilling sites in the high Arctic. A company plane on a routine flight that was to end in disaster and dispute. It's been nearly a year since that air crash in which 32 people died. And yet here in Yellowknife, an inquest which was called on the 1st of April has lurched along in an atmosphere of headlines and accusations without coming up with any real answers. Many of the answers are only known to 2 men who miraculously survived the crash: David Hatton, co-pilot of the plane, and the flight engineer, Gary Wayman. On the advice of lawyers of the Panarctic Oil Company, the owners of the plane, neither man has testified at the inquest. And that started rumors of a cover-up. Why do you think you've been accused of obstructing the inquest?
I think my answer to that has got to be who's obstructing who. We haven't obstructed anybody. We have made everything available to anybody who has asked us.
On October 30th, the plane left Edmonton for its regular destination, Ray Point on Melville Island, near the top of the world. At night, in a blowing snowstorm, during the final descent, it happened. The captain, Brian Thompson, and 31 passengers died, not all of them immediately. About half the men were still alive after impact, but they were severely injured and froze to death in minutes. Saws were needed to cut the bodies from the ice. Other victims had to be brought up from the frigid waters below the ice, near the shore of Melville Island. Recovery operations were slow because there were only 2 hours of light each day. At night, men with rifles guarded the scene to keep wolves and polar bears from ravaging the bodies. An RCMP constable recorded the Fahrenheit temperature. With the wind chill factor, it was 103 degrees below zero. Even in the Arctic summer, Ray Point is a pretty desolate spot. Although most Canadians don't realize it, hundreds of men work up here. At Panarctic's drilling sites, they're on 2-week shifts, and not surprisingly, at the end of each shift, there's a stampede to get out. It's a harsh existence that earns high wages, but it's hard work with no liquor and no women. It was a similar group of men who died in the crash. Up to 5 times a week, the Electra ferries workers to and from the private airstrip, which is just 60 miles from the North Magnetic Pole. Panarctic owns the airline, and Panarctic's biggest shareholder is the federal government. Surprisingly, no federal government regulations exist to monitor the Ray Point Strip. Since the crash, rumors about the airline's safety have flourished. Since the inquest, the rumors have become allegations. Both coroner and Crown Attorney accused Panarctic of trying to prevent witnesses from giving evidence, although witnesses said they made the decision by themselves with legal advice. The accusations went on, and most headlines directed the blame at Panarctic.
I think the press coverage has been dreadful. We really and truly are upset about it.
Bob Curry is vice president of Panarctic.
We have issued press releases, and they don't come out the way we issue them, and they're editorialized, and we simply don't know how to handle it.
But they're learning. Panarctic has now filed a motion in the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories to quash the inquest, and the allegations have become muted. In Yellowknife, the coroner is Walter England, who runs the local hardware store. He now refuses to discuss the inquest. As for the alleged cover-up by Panarctic, no comment. It was the same with the Crown Attorney, Ed Brogdon, a young lawyer with 2.5 years' experience. He also publicly accused Panarctic of obstruction, but he won't comment now.
During the course of the inquest, I was quoted, and inevitably, if you look, you'll see that the only things I said were things that had actually already occurred during the proceedings.
It results.
In the meantime, a top defense lawyer, Milt Harridance from Calgary, has taken up the case of the 2 survivors.
These men, according to the lawyer and to the coroner, were alleged to have left Canada in order to avoid testifying. Nothing could be further from the truth. These remarks are defamatory, and as I said earlier, we're considering legal action. If they are repeated, legal action will definitely follow.
We think that the coroner has taken some liberties. And we think that, for example, the lawyer who was up there representing the company should certainly not have been thrown out of court because he wanted to go and look at the documents. Furthermore, we've been denied access to the transcripts. And this is incredible.
So we decided to look into the inquest, and our investigation has revealed that it's been conducted in a strange and irregular way. All the members of the jury were chosen not from the general public, but from the aviation industry. The jury foreman, Willie Lazarich, is a pilot who has been accused of minor offenses under the Aeronautics Act. His prosecutor is Ed Brogden, the same lawyer involved in the inquest. It's a clear conflict of interest. Another juror, Frank O'Connor, has a company that has competed for Panarctic business. Another conflict of interest. And Lazarich says that on one day of the inquest, the jury was not even called. He was in Edmonton at the time and read about it in the Edmonton Journal.
I was in Edmonton and I read the Edmonton Journal, and there it was.
The fact that the jury wasn't present on the fifth day of the inquest typifies the kind of inquest it has been. Normally, in a disaster of this magnitude, with 32 people suddenly dead, there is a full investigation before the inquest begins. The police go out and conduct exhaustive inquiries. They try to interview every possible witness and get statements from those witnesses. This investigation was placed in the hands of an RCMP constable, Dave Fogarty, 23 years old. He has yet to visit Panarctic offices in Calgary, and in his search for evidence has never left the Northwest Territories, although many witnesses live in the South. In this case, there are two key witnesses, the survivors, Wayman and Hatton. Both say that they are willing to testify. Not only have they never been subpoenaed, they've never even been interviewed by the RCMP.
No arrangements have been made for their transportation, no arrangements were ever made for their expenses, and no arrangements were ever made as to for what dates they were supposed to attend in the Northwest Territories.
Gary Wayman, the flight engineer who survived, still works for Panarctic. He says he's willing to testify, but has never been called to the inquest. Since the crash, you've been back several times to the Northwest Territories, haven't you?
Yes, 14 times.
14 times.
Right.
Have you ever been contacted by the RCMP?
No, I haven't.
Where were you staying those times?
Mostly in and out of Ray Point, and spent 2 days in Yellowknife on a weather delay at the Explorer Hotel.
How far is that from the RCMP headquarters in Yellowknife?
It's about 800 feet, I guess.
Were you expecting to see the RCMP?
Yes, it was.
But it didn't happen.
No.
Were you ever subpoenaed?
No, I wasn't.
Did you expect to be?
Yes, sure did.
And there are other witnesses who have been available, but who have never been called or even interviewed. A leading air crash pathologist found that the pilot, Brian Thompson, had a liver twice its normal size. That report was read to the jury by another doctor.
Now, even at an inquest, I think that's totally unacceptable. There may well have been questions which the coroner would want to have asked the doctor who conducted the autopsy. There certainly would have been questions that the counsel for the survivors would have wanted to ask, and I'm sure that the jury would have wanted to ask questions. But once you insulate that by having someone else read a report, then it seems to me that that is totally unsatisfactory.
An official from the Ministry of Transport was allowed to testify to the jury off the record. And the jury itself. The role of a jury is to judge the issues from the facts placed before it. Incredibly, in this case, on 2 occasions, the jury was allowed to submit evidence of its own. And another peculiar feature. In the 5th volume of the transcript of the proceedings, one answer from a witness was struck from the record. That answer came from the last person to actually speak to the aircraft before the crash. He's Rod Brooks, who was then radio operator at Ray Point, but now lives in northern Saskatchewan. He came to the inquest on his own, without subpoena, and he says the Crown Attorney and the coroner gave him special consideration.
When you arrived for the inquest, RCMP Constable Fogarty met you at the airport, and then what happened?
We went up to his room in the Explorer Hotel in Yellowknife, and we had a meal, and Ed Brogdon, the Crown Attorney, and the coroner, Walt England, both came up, and we talked about what my testimony would be, and we rehearsed a few questions that Mr. Brogdon wanted to ask. What I would be giving was on my own hook, and because it was on my own hook, I was a little leery of a few things I might say. So Mr. Brogdon suggested that I testify under the evidence ordinance or something to that effect. So we rehearsed a question that I would not want to answer.
So I don't rehearse questions with anybody, not at any time prior to going to court.
Well, when they rehearsed this question, did that question subsequently come up in the inquest?
That was a funny point. It came up as a different question, and instead of refusing to answer the question and take this protection, I did answer the question, and Mr. Brogdon looked at me like, what are you doing? So it was pretty funny, and that question was struck from the records, and we tried it again. I did it right.
You may certainly discuss things with the witness beforehand, go over it, indicate how the court works and what kind of questions I might be asking. But there is no way that I rehearse questions with anyone, anytime, including Mr. Brooks.
All right, supposing you don't rehearse questions, did you agree not to touch certain sensitive areas with him?
No. I think, as I said,
What was the question that Rod Brooks, the radio operator, didn't want to answer? We'll come back to that later. First, there's the matter of the other key witness, David Hatton, the co-pilot, who has still to be interviewed by the RCMP.
We found the witnesses. It seems to me strange that they never appeared at the inquest.
Well, again, I can't say anything at all. I really can't. I would ask, when did you find it?
It was a few weeks ago in San Francisco that I interviewed David Hatton. There was no problem in tracing him. He was not on the run from the inquest. For a brief time, he was out of Canada for an operation at this hospital.
Both Gary and I have received some very bad publicity over the thing. Some of the press clippings seem to read that we both escaped with very minor injuries and kind of walked away from this thing unscathed.
David Hatton's hands were frostbitten at 100 below. He was still able to write his name even before the operation. But now, to give him greater dexterity, he's being prepared for a digital transplant. The thumb on his right hand is to be rebuilt, using the stump of a finger from his other hand. After snipping through 2 sets of nerves and tendons, veins and arteries, the surgeons graft the finger stump onto the ravaged thumb. The work is done under microscopes and lasts 9 hours. The San Francisco hospital where the transplant took place has built a reputation for this type of microsurgery. Ultimately, if it's successful, David Hatton will once again have hands flexible enough to operate the controls of a passenger plane.
So you can figure it'll take you about 3 or 4 months to get sensation down to the tip. But that won't be normal. It'll be sort of too much. It'll be hypersensitive.
I see.
And after a while, that hypersensitivity will settle down, and you should end up with sensation enough so you can tell hot and cold, and maybe able to tell the difference.
After the operation, in his first interview since the crash, David Hatton told me the story of his survival. He says he has good reason to consider himself lucky, for he knows he could have died in at least a dozen ways.
In seconds, we'd gone from a perfectly normal approach and sitting in a warm, comfortable cockpit at room temperature to an aircraft crash, complete disintegration, myself being trapped in the cockpit when it sank. The water temperature was 28 degrees, and the experts tell me that you can last for about 3 minutes in that kind of water. It probably, as the cockpit sank, the water swirling in around the cockpit must have swept me out the back end. That's the only way I can possibly explain my getting out of there.
And then from the water to the ice, how did that happen?
I bobbed to the surface, I remember, and swam over to the edge of the ice. Gary Wayman, the flight engineer, was standing on the edge of the ice. I called his name, and he came over, reached down and grabbed me and pulled me out onto the ice. And I was soaking wet, of course, and everything froze on me right away. Gary was able to get me on my feet. I wasn't able to stand because of my back injury. I put one hand around his neck, my left hand. The other hand I had to use as a crutch on my right knee. I remember I was gasping, gulping for air, and the cold was so intense it was just indescribable. I had to force myself to breathe through my nose to keep from freezing my lungs. And I remember we sat there for a moment and tried to discuss things. We turned and looked over the crash site, and I can remember the crash occurred about 12:30 at night, and everything was completely black. But the crash site was engulfed in flame from the fuel tanks, but because of the intensity of the wind, the flames are almost horizontal with the ground. And I can remember off in the distance, there was just complete devastation you can't describe. It was how badly the airplane had been destroyed. And off in the distance, I can remember seeing the tail section of the airplane sticking up out of the ice, and it was lit up with flame, and it was slowly sinking. I can remember the wind howling, this terrible sound of this wind roaring over the ice. Just a chance in 1,000. Just after Gary started walking me, we came across a heavy down-filled Arctic parka which was laying on the ice. And Gary picked it up and wrapped me up in it, did up the zippers and pulled the hood up over my head and buttoned everything up. And I remember I felt better right away. If it hadn't been for Gary being there or us coming across that parka, I would certainly have frozen to death.
Death by freezing was the fate of several of the victims. Others drowned, burned, or died of their injuries on the nightmare landscape. Both survivors did what they could.
We kept walking towards the tail section, and as we made our way through the debris and wreckage, I can remember the ice shifting under our feet. It was broken up from the impact. We were walking in amongst some patches of flame, and we did come across some people, incredibly, that were still alive. Most were very badly injured and died within minutes. I remember one chap in particular we came across. He was still strapped in the seat, a double seat, lying face down on the ice. And there was a lot of flame around. The seat was covered in kerosene. It was burning. The man's pants and legs were on fire, and he was still alive. And I remember Gary carrying me, half dragging me, carrying me over there, and we tried to help this chap. And I can remember was very little I could do because of my back injury. Gary tried to help him. The two of us tried to lift the seat off him, but because of the weight of the seat, because of Gary's injuries and my own, we couldn't lift the seat off him. I can remember Gary desperately trying to put the flames out. Trying to put the flames out with his hands.
Was there any snow around to do it with?
No, there was no snow. Just the ice. And I remember because of the intensity of the wind and because he was soaked with kerosene, he was unable to put the flames out with his hands. I can remember towards the end, we're both very tired. I know myself, every instinct tells you you just want to curl up beside a piece of wreckage and just go to sleep. You're so much pain and so tired, it's just what you want to do, and it becomes a mental thing. You've just got to fight it and keep going. And towards the end, I was in so much pain that I couldn't walk anymore. And every once in a while, Gary would get up and look, and finally he saw the lights of the rescue party off in the distance as they were making their way towards us. And I was barely conscious at that time. And I can remember he came over and he kicked me in the side of the leg. And he said, "Don't you die on me now, you son of a bitch. They're just about here. They're coming. And stay awake." And I remember I was really angry at this. And I said to Gary, "Don't kick me." And I said, "I'm going to stay awake long enough to kick you in the ass." And it sounds crazy, but that's what kept us going. The two of us were really mad at one another, and the adrenaline kept flowing. And I remember I kept digging the heel of my boot into the snow, just kicking at it, and yelling at Gary, and yelling for the rescue party to come. And I remember when they finally got there, being barely conscious, but the first rescue people on the scene went into almost a state of shock themselves. They were working under terrible conditions, blizzard. When they finally found us, the first couple of people almost went into shock themselves. One young fellow began throwing up, and the other fellows were almost in a daze. And after all this and all that Gary had been through, he made an attempt to organize these fellows to point out the places where the other survivors might be found, where the other bodies were, and it was him that got the first fellows organized, and just an incredible feat after all he'd gone through. Just a remarkable person.
Do they have anything to be afraid of in going to the inquest?
I don't believe they have anything to be afraid of. And I'm satisfied that when the facts do come out in the proper forum, that one of these men will be decorated.
But in the minds of those relatives who remain, the relatives of the people who died in the air disaster, there are still some very serious questions. I mean, they want to know, what do the survivors know? Are they hiding something?
Well, I can assure you that the survivors are hiding nothing.
Are you concerned that there might be civil action arising from this?
Well, I have no doubt that civil action will flow from this crash for damages. Just who will be sued or what the cause of action will be, I'm not sure. But certainly when something like this happens, you've got to assume that civil action will probably flow from it.
From Panarctic's point of view, the thing is entirely in the hands of the insurance company, and they are looking after the entire matter. We have not received any notices. We've got no indication that there are any claims forthcoming, and when they do, they'll be turned over to the insurance company for handling.
But is there an admission of negligence in that?
I don't think there's an admission of negligence, but I don't think it matters, because somewhere in the contract, and I can't reconstruct the exact wording, it says that we will simply not do anything which will in any way place the insurance company in a difficult position. Now, that's layman's language. The legal terminology goes a little further, but the insurance company has absolutely full control of how this matter is handled. Absolute control. It says so in the contract, and if we violate that, we've got no insurance.
It's been said that Panarctic has wanted to obstruct the inquest because they were worried about large claims from the relatives of the deceased.
That's not true. That's simply not true. We don't want to obstruct anything. We have got nothing to hide. Adrienne, we run a squeaky clean airline. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. We are not about to obstruct anything in any way, shape, or form.
If the airline is squeaky clean, how safe are the flying conditions? In the Arctic, the weather can change suddenly and fiercely. But at Ray Point, there are no qualified weather observers. And then there's the question that Rod Brooks, the radio operator, didn't want to answer.
The question was, did I have a license? And the answer was no, a radio operator's license. And I had a good answer for that. That was a question that I really didn't want to have asked because I didn't have a license. And it was Panarctic had a general license to operate its own operators. And whether that was good enough, that's not up to me.
Unlicensed radio operators might be acceptable at a remote and little-used airstrip. Ray Point is remote, but the air traffic is greater than at many airports in the south of Canada. And for all this traffic, there are no Ministry of Transport regulations. Air traffic control comes from this shack, and it was here that Rod Brooks worked, unlicensed.
Ray Point is one of the busiest airstrips in Canada. With one shift I've worked on, 12-hour shift, I've logged 50 aircraft movements. In the summer, I've been in a situation where I've had 3 Herculeses estimating within 3 minutes of each other, then an Electra taking off at the same time. And then we had Geoservices helicopters flying in and around. They never told us anything. So it got fairly hectic, and you're really biting your nails quite a bit. I had to work 20 hours a day, on and off. I'd sleep for a half an hour, work for another 6 hours, sleep for an hour or 2. And I think the longest stretch in that 8 days is I got 6 hours sleep.
Well, I don't know how many landings we have in the Arctic in a day. In a busy season with 5 rigs working, I would suppose that all across the Arctic we could maybe have up to 100 landings. I'm satisfied that the Electra would not land at Ray Point or any other location without having radio confirmation of his position, without getting the weather, without getting the altimeter readings, and all the rest of the things that those pilots require. They simply would not go in. Our requirements are more stringent than MOT, and we just don't break them. In that country, you don't take any chances. There's no place to go for help.
Well, in my mind, I'd like to know what happened in the cockpit of the aircraft. That's the big question in my mind. What exactly was Brian Thompson doing when the plane hit the ice 2 miles short?
It is still not publicly known what happened in the cockpit that night, but we have now obtained 2 signed statements made by Hatton and Wayman to the Ministry of Transport nearly a year ago. The Ministry has withheld these statements from the inquest. The statements give clear evidence of pilot error. What the captain believed to be a layer of cloud was in reality a field of Arctic ice, and he tried to fly underneath it. Both Hatton and Wayman tried at the last moment, 50 feet above, to get the aircraft up again, but it was too late. As Wayman told an investigator from the Ministry of Transport, the captain said that he thought that the aircraft was just on top of a layer of cloud, and he pushed the controls forward. The first officer called through 100 feet, and we both called through 50 feet. My hand was on the power levers for the last 700 feet of the approach. At 50 feet, I felt a hand on mine on the power levers. There was no call for power before we hit.
From the beginning, the inquest has been hamstrung by a lack of evidence. The main obstruction has been the inquest officials themselves. They failed to insist on full disclosure from the Ministry of Transport. They allowed the ministry's investigators to withhold vital material from the jury, although there is no law giving them that right. With the MOT's evidence from Hatton and Wayman, speculation about a cover-up would have come to a swift end months ago.
But even with the factual statements from the survivors, there are still many questions unanswered. Questions that for the moment are lost in the bitter feud between Panarctic's lawyers and the inquest officials. They're the kind of questions that are only going to get answered through decisive action from Ottawa. Nearly a year after the crash here at the top of the world, it's time now for a full-scale public inquiry.